Welcome to the Strokecast. A Generation X stroke survivor explores rehab, recovery, the frontiers of neuroscience, and how to peel a banana with one hand.
Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to episode 52 of the Strokecast. This week, we'll be talking about sex and intimacy after stroke. That means I will be talking about adult themes, but, not really anything you won't hear on primetime TV. It'll probably be less funny, though. But first, I want to mark an important milestone. I've been doing this show every week for a full year now. Many podcasts don't actually make it past episode 7. So I want to take a moment to thank all of my guests and listeners for generously sharing your knowledge, your time, and your attention as we work together to help grow the connections within the survivor, caregiver, medical, and Friend of Strokecast communities. And of course, I have to thank my girlfriend Cathy for her fantastic support, patience, and graphic design on both the show and my general stroke recovery. And we're just getting started. If you're new to Strokecast, please subscribe for free in your favorite podcast app after this episode. About 2 weeks after my stroke, I was laying in my hospital bed and was finally able to start thinking, more midterm. Like, what was life going to look like when I left the hospital? What lifestyle changes would I have to make? What was going to be different? What should I stop doing? And, what should I start doing? And I have started some of that stuff, but that's another matter altogether. My original neurologist had made it clear that the 5-shot venti Americanos I had been getting at Starbucks on a regular basis were going to have to stop. He did allow the single shots to continue because, as he said, this is still Seattle. I'm not going to take away all your coffee. That week, though, my rehab doctor managed to get all of my vice-related questions over the course of several days. Could I continue to drink alcohol? She said yes, but just don't drown your brain in it. This is Washington State, so should I consume cannabis? She said, if it's not already part of your lifestyle, now is probably not a good time to start. That was actually part of a fairly nuanced conversation. In 2017, the studies were showing that marijuana inhibited the brain development in adolescents, and she was extrapolating that to post-stroke adult brain damage recovery. If I was experiencing a lot of pain or dealing with nausea significant enough that I couldn't eat, her answer might very well have been different. But that's something we're going to have to explore in a future episode. I also asked about sex. Would it be safe after stroke? Her recommendation was, just don't fall. Dr. Steen had a way of having nuanced discussions that were very easy to sum up in basic directions like that. A side note here is that much post-stroke and stroke prevention care is really all about living with moderation. It's the extremes that get many people into trouble. Still, you ought to talk with your own medical team to get advice for your specific situation. Every stroke is different, and every survivor is also different. I began working on this episode several months ago. It seemed like a good idea in the lead up to Valentine's Day. I began reaching out to my network of support groups, survivors, and professionals to find a guest who could talk about sex after stroke. The response I got was generally along the lines of, that's an awesome idea. Let me see if I know anyone. We tried unsuccessfully to make some of those connections, but they just didn't turn out. This is one of the things that's very interesting about this topic, is that there are some resources online, but not many. And there don't appear to be many professionals who specialize in helping stroke survivors navigate issues around sex and intimacy. And why is that? There's a general societal taboo in talking about sex in a formal way, but it's still roughly 98% of the internet and a driving force in mass media and advertising. But there's just really not as much conversation about sex as there are about other topics post-stroke. And there could be a number of issues. I imagine the first is a question of age that impacts a lot of stroke discussion. While more people are having strokes at younger ages than in the past, there is still a perception that stroke happens only to folks who are old. And of course, the broader culture would have us believe that older folks are asexual beings, regardless of whether or not that's true. The second issue may have to do with how the broader culture views folks with disabilities. Often folks with disabilities are thought of as asexual as well, or outside the conversation about sex, or fetishized in pornography. There's a broader conversation starting to happen here around seeing folks with disabilities as whole people with rich individual lives, desires, goals, thoughts, and more. I'd actually love to hear from our neuro cousins in the cerebral palsy, MS, ALS, TBI, and other brain injury communities to understand, how sex is talked about in those contexts. So really, the point I want to make here is that this episode will be a high-level discussion. I'm not offering many detailed solutions. I do want to give you an opportunity to think about some of these concerns and communicate with the appropriate people in your personal and professional life to get the most out of that life. When it comes to sex and relationships, that's probably just generally good advice, regardless of whether or not you've had a stroke. If you'd like to read more about these issues, you can check out the articles I read as I prepared this episode over at strokecast.com/sex. There are 7 areas I want to introduce today: safety, physical factors, psychological factors, medication factors, contraception, relationship dynamics, and consent and communications. First, let's start with the big question. Is sex and orgasm after stroke safe, or will I have another stroke? That's the question I think most survivors are asking. The good news is that sex and orgasm are unlikely to cause another stroke. Of course, you'll want to check with your own doctor to be sure, but the vast majority of survivors, it will be fine. Sex has a similar cardiovascular impact as climbing a couple flights of stairs. And of course, my doctor's advice applies there too. Don't fall. Interestingly, there is some evidence to indicate there's a slightly higher risk in extramarital sex. So as long as you're not cheating on your partner, you should be fine. The primary risk, of course, is falling. Depending on the deficits that result from your stroke, balance may be off and weak limbs may not provide the support you're used to. Falling can be bad for weak joints or subluxed shoulders or skulls recovering from surgery. Blood thinners may make falls even more dangerous with increased risk of internal bleeding or just nasty looking bruises. But of course, that risk isn't unique to sex. One of the caution I would suggest is around tone and spasticity. Folks who haven't had a stroke may talk about toe-curling orgasms as the epitome of good sex. That's actually a tone response, as orgasm pulls the body into itself to focus on that experience. Post-stroke, when already dealing with tone, when already dealing with toes that may curl, or fingers that may tighten up into a really tight fist, orgasm can drive a more intense tone or spastic response. Toes may curl, fists may suddenly curl, arms and legs may curl or extend involuntarily. So make sure you know where your limbs are in relation to your partner's parts so you don't injure them. Secondly, let's explore the physical factors. Hemiplegia and hemiparesis are common results of stroke. Losing use of half of one's limbs is always complicated, and it may require something as simple as alternative positioning. As a general rule, the more mobile and physically well-balanced participant probably ought to be the one on top. You can use pillows to provide additional support and make positioning more comfortable. So talk with your partner, experiment, and, get creative. And isn't that supposed to be half the fun anyway? You can also consult your occupational or physical therapists for advice. They are professionals who can help. Generally, I believe sex falls under occupational therapy as an activity of daily living. So ask them. They can point you to the appropriate resources. You can have a frank discussion with your care team. Of course, as always, be candid, not creepy. You can also find adaptive gear to facilitate sex on the internet because, of course, you can. Another concern folks have is about incontinence. Trips to the bathroom before sex may alleviate those concerns, and appropriate padding or protection for the bed can also be a good choice. Impotence or lack of physical arousal is another challenge too. Again, there are any number of adaptive tools and solutions that can help, and sexual activity doesn't always have to mean intercourse. So there are options. Again, talk with your partner and medical team about how you can all work together as appropriate. Numbness or sensitivity changes in parts of the body are also common after stroke and can have an impact. Of course, fatigue is also an issue, especially for newer survivors. That may make sex at the end of the day much more challenging and require changes to routine. The things that affect us outside of a sexual context in our post-stroke lives also impact our lives within a sexual context after stroke. And that brings us to the third area I want to touch on, the psychological factors. Fear, questions of self-worth, wondering if you're attractive. These are all challenges that folks who haven't had a stroke have to navigate when it comes to sex. They become even bigger issues post-stroke. It goes beyond standard insecurities, though. Depression is a condition many stroke survivors have to deal with. It can ramp up fears and anxiety. It can make it hard to do things you find pleasure in. And, of course, as Will Wheaton has told us all on the internet, depression lies to you. It can also kill your sex drive and prevent physical arousal. Plus, medication used to treat depression can also drive down libido. If depression, medication, or other psychological issues may be impacting your sex life, you guessed it. Consult with your medical team to work on an appropriate solution. This brings us to the fourth issue, medication. A lot of sexual activity is related to blood flow. Everything from erection to arousal to more. Of course, blood flow issues caused our strokes to begin with. The blood either stopped flowing to part of the brain or poured into part of the brain where it shouldn't. Blood pressure medication that we use to, help us stay alive and not have more strokes can also inhibit sex. And yet, stopping those medications would likely be a terrible idea. One suggestion that I've seen online is to plan sexual activity in the morning before taking your medication for the day. Men who are dealing with erectile dysfunction may be interested in medications like Viagra and similar drugs to treat it, but those meds also modify blood flow throughout the body. In fact, it's why they actually work. And it's also why they can be a terrible idea after stroke. So, again, talk with your medical team about your medications and its side effects, and talk with your team about what you can take to address other conditions that you have. And that brings us to number 5, contraception. A pregnancy after stroke is often considered high risk. The medication a survivor may be on and the cardiovascular issues and other challenges a stroke survivor lives with can make carrying a child to term riskier. And those things can also pose risks to the child. That's not to say stroke survivors can't have healthy children. They absolutely can and do every day. It does require closer monitoring and care. At the same time, many stroke survivors can no longer take birth control pills due to the risk of clotting. Last thing you want is another clot floating up into the brain. Condoms can also be a challenging one-handed operation. I mean, I have enough challenges opening a Ziploc bag of cookies in the living room in the light of day, let alone a sealed condom packet in the heat of passion. Again, talk with your medical team about appropriate options for contraception or for pregnancy, if that is what you're looking for. But the key is have a plan in place and try to focus on executing that plan to make sure everybody involved is able to be as healthy as possible. So obviously, a lot of this conversation revolves around the relationship dynamic that you may have with your partner. And that brings us to the sixth area, changes to that dynamic. A couple may go from a relationship of equals to a relationship that is almost parental after stroke, depending on the level of care that the survivor needs from their caregiver. And being a caregiver can be tough. It can be exhausting work. Plus, there's the stress of already having your life turned upside down by this stroke. And if the survivor was the primary breadwinner in the family, you've got finances turned upside down. And all of those roles are now backwards. And then you have to transition back from taking care of this person to seeing this person as a sexually desirable individual. And that's not always easy to do. On the flip side, the survivor has to see their partner become their caretaker and then feel internally that they themselves are still going to be desirable to that person who is taking care of them and keeping them alive and fed and cleaned. Getting a break from caregiving can be healthy for the relationship. Hiring outside help can make that possible, as well as exploring local social services that may also be able to help. Again, it doesn't mean that sex is off the table, although, come to think of it, the table might actually increase the fall risk. It just means that there's one more issue to navigate. And that brings us to the seventh and final area, consent and communications. When we talk about communication after stroke, the big topic that comes up is aphasia. Many folks lose access to verbal or other forms of language after a stroke. A couple may need to rely on touch, gesture, tone of voice, and other nonverbal communication tools to discuss and share their needs with one another. But what about cognitive challenges? Can someone with an executive thinking dysfunction, memory issues, or other processing challenges willfully consent to sex? Maybe. Maybe not. It's an important topic for partners to discuss among themselves and with the appropriate medical professionals to get the right answers and understand just how well somebody is, in fact, able to consent. There are very important ethical considerations here. And considering the incidence of sexual assault on those with disabilities, there can be important legal issues to be aware of too. Obviously, lack of resistance to sex is not the same as affirmative consent. Our culture is now having a long overdue conversation about consent, and brain injury survivors and their partners need to be a part of that conversation. Of course, depending on exactly where the stroke happens, the survivor may become hypersexual and act out in inappropriate contexts. Helping to establish appropriate boundaries is important so that everybody's need for consent is respected. Communication and consent can be a complicated, nuanced, and highly individualized issue that will need to be addressed on a case-by-case basis. So, again, talk with each other, talk with your partners, talk with your medical team, and get the best information to develop a plan to go forward. So, I don't know if I've solved anything with this discussion. I do hope that it helps you to open up your own personal discussion with whomever you ought to be having it with. It's a discussion that many people agree needs to happen, but too often it still doesn't. Sex will, of course, remain a powerful force and continue to impact the dynamics of interpersonal relationships a survivor maintains. It doesn't just become moot because someone has a disability. That really just changes the conversation. As you consider your own or your partner's sex life, I hope this can provide a framework for those conversations about safety, physical factors, psychological factors, medication, contraception, relationship dynamics, and consent and communications. And most importantly, I've taken my doctor's advice and not fallen. And that brings us to our hack of the week. Egg whites in a carton. I like eggs. Fried, poached, scrambled, omeletted, and more. I'm sure that may have contributed to how I ended up with this stroke in the first place. But of course, post-stroke, I'm supposed to cut down on things that can raise cholesterol, like complete eggs. For healthy eating, it's not actually the entire egg that's the problem, it's the yolk. So now, sitting in my fridge next to the eggs is a carton of egg white. When I make what used to be a 3 to 4 egg dish, I now use just one regular egg, and I make up the rest of the volume with egg white from the carton. I still get the taste and texture I want, and it's a lot healthier with even more protein. It gets better though. Because I have use of only one hand, I have to crack eggs with just one hand on a surface that I can't actually knock over. I can do it, but it's not the easiest thing in the world. With a carton of egg whites, I don't have to crack all those eggs myself. I only have to crack the one, and then I can just pour in egg white from the carton for the rest of it. It makes things a heck of a lot easier. So, that's it for this week. You can read more about sex after stroke over at strokecast.com/sex. I'd love it if you could also share your thoughts on sex after stroke also in the comments at strokecast.com/sex. Please share this episode with a friend, partner, colleague, or other party who might be interested in sex after stroke by giving them the link strokecast.com/sex. And of course, as always, don't get best, get better. I look forward to an exciting year 2 for Strokecast. Thanks a lot for listening. I'm Bill Monroe, and I'll talk to you next week.
The Strokecast, Bill Monroe, and Bill's guests provide general information and entertainment, not medical advice. Please do not make any changes to your treatment plan or the execution of your treatment plan without first consulting your personal doctor or medical team. The Strokecast is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.